I had the opportunity to hike Crater Lake in the spring of 2018. I'm not from the Pacific Northwest, so the chance to see a new part of the country at my age wasn't something I could just pass up. It might be the single most beautiful part of the United States. The clarity of the water, the history of the collapsed volcano that formed the lake's bed. It's magical. The last thing on my mind when we set up camp 3 miles northeast of Cleetwood Cove was the years I wasted harassing conspiracy theorists on the internet. I was still entranced by the beauty of the world around us. Then, after the sunset, I was hypnotized all over again by the sea of stars that waited for us in the nighttime sky. My friend and I spent a long while by the campfire before retiring to our tents. The ground was stiff, but sleep still found me easily. We'd learn later that we both woke around the same time. There was a low growl outside of my tent. I could barely hear it, but I could feel it in my chest. I woke and the hairs on my arms were already standing on end. Something heavy shifted its feet in the dirt outside my tent. I heard slow breathing and a heavy snort. I read about what to do in a bear attack. I couldn't remember a single word at that moment. If it was a bear, I thought, I was done for. Even when I was stricken by that fear, I felt the trip was worth it. At least I got to see Crater Lake, I remember thinking. Then came the sound of a few quick strides. The low growl, the breathing, it was all suddenly gone. I didn't hear the animal's feet hit the ground more than 3 times, and it had still cleared our camp completely. There was no sign of it among the trees when I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. My friend was out there too. It was his ghost-white expression that drew my attention to the dirt. I followed his eyes and I found it. All around our campsite was a pattern of tracks, shaped like the foot of a man or an ape. One print was so close to the entrance of my tent that I could already compare it to the size of my own feet. I could stand toe to heel and still not cover that whole track. All my years as a skeptic came rushing back to me. I imagine as I looked down at the impossible footprint that I was overcome by the same compulsion that motivated all those believers on the message boards. I needed to know. My friend had already started packing up. I ran in the direction of the tracks instead. I tried to stay low and quiet, but if I'm being honest, I'm no hunter. I'm sure the beast knew I was coming. If that's the case, then it let me close in. I spotted it between the trees. The hulking, hairy shape was illuminated well by the sky full of stars. I ducked behind a tree and hoped that the trunk would protect me from any sort of retaliation. To my surprise, the massive ape-like thing didn't turn to face me. It was staring at the ground, working a crooked tree branch across the ground like a rake. Seeing the animal use a tool was terrifying enough. That meant it was smart, right? That meant it couldn't be far from human. I crept in a circle around the animal, scaling a short hill to get a better view of the dirt it was tilling. That was when I realized what the monster was doing. There was another one. Whatever this massive ape-like creature was, it wasn't an anomaly. There was another of the beasts lying in a grave at the feet of the monster I'd followed. Tools. Burial rituals. My heart dropped into my stomach. I ran again, this time back toward the campsite. There was a roar behind me. Was it a roar or a howl? I couldn't have imagined it. It started low and rose into a shrill, trailed off into 3 barking yelps. The sound spread a heat in my gut like lightning. I was sure the animal was going to follow me back and punish me for what I'd seen. It wasn't until we were in the car that I told my friend what was out there. They didn't believe me. I went online and tried to share my story. As you can imagine, I wasn't the most reliable source of new information. I'm telling you now to explain, to present a theory that maybe you haven't considered. All these sightings, the cryptids, and the things that go bump in the night, I know you've asked the same questions I have. Maybe we haven't found their bones because they're heartfelt enough to bury their dead. Maybe we haven't found that single piece of irrefutable proof because they're smart enough to hide it from us. No one really believes me. They listen, but I know they don't really believe anything I'm about to tell you. It doesn't matter. Anyways, I went to see family in Phoenix. I go every few months. No one likes that I live in Chicago. You know how it can be with family. If you're not living 10 minutes away, the sky is going to fall. All hell will break loose, you know. I get with my cousins. We're hanging out with a few of their friends, and they want to go outside the city to a park with a big rock in the shape of a ring. I'm down. That seems okay. They say we might even see a rattlesnake or desert hare or something. I could see some animals in the wild, why not? We grab some beers and jump in my cousin's Jeep, and they go into a pickup and we go. It was almost dark, like the sun was just ready to disappear. We get there, it didn't take too long, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes max. There were a few other cars, not too many. I guess most people were leaving because it was getting dark. I don't know. Anyway, we park next to a little lake or pond, whatever, open some beers and start throwing rocks, skipping them across the water. It was weird though, someone across the parking lot was fighting with their dog. He was going nuts, and the owners were trying to pull him into their car. He was whining and barking and thrashing around in their arms. I've never seen a dog do that before. We just kind of watched, and the owners seemed embarrassed. We should have paid more attention to that dog man. We really should have. So we start walking around and goofing around, how people are with their family and friends. One guy was looking for snakes. My cousin said to watch out for killer bees. Apparently they are an issue now in AZ, and people keep running into them. I was nursing a beer, as I'm not really a big drinker, never have been. It was hot though, you know, and I'm not used to the heat anymore. You get used to your new surroundings. Chicago, even in the summer, is nowhere near Arizona heat. Anyway, we all walked around the park. I started to help look for snakes, overturning rocks, rattling through some of the tall grasses with a stick. I've never actually seen a rattlesnake outside of the zoo. I've heard them while walking, they rattle to scare you away, but I've never actually seen one. My cousin and his friends convinced me it would be cool to see. I guess I felt braver with a stick in my hand. Sounds kinda corny now, though. We didn't find any snakes. We saw some birds, and someone yelled about a lizard that they found on a rock. We were just laughing, talking, telling stories. My cousin's friends asked me about Chicago and what living there was like, you know, normal stuff. They had spent pretty much their entire lives in Arizona and had never gone to far north or east. It is kind of a different world, I suppose. I didn't think anything I was saying was interesting, but they seemed to want to know. That's when we heard the noises. Weird whining at first, then a howling. Someone said it was coyotes, so we began to walk around looking for them. They apparently have no fear of humans anymore, I guess. We climbed up some rocks and looked around. We couldn't really see anything, and it was getting darker. My cousin said that sometimes sound is weird in the desert, and maybe they were farther away. We heard it again, and a kind of yipping noise, but it sounded like there was more than one now. It sounded closer too. I didn't see anything until my foot slipped when I tried to get higher up on the rocks. At first it was just a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and then I saw a tail, and it looked like it could be a coyote. I ran down to some rocks that were right below me, and I stood really still and quiet. I've seen coyote before from far away, never up close, and I knew they didn't really fear people anymore. They'll run right past you, or go into your garbage and rummage around for food. I've even heard people say they'll come to your front door looking for food if they're really brave. Everybody seemed to just stop and look around them. Nobody even whispered to each other. We kept hearing things moving, brushing past rocks. It was pretty eerie. Hearing things moving around you but not being able to see them or really tell in what direction they were moving. I turned to my cousin and they just mouthed that they were freaked out. I just smiled and turned back, looking left and right, trying to pin down what was moving around us. I thought it ran behind some of the rocks down maybe 10 or 15 feet below me, but something stood up, like a person, and its eyes flashed like a dog's or cat's when they catch the light, and I heard the yipping again right next to me. I turned, then turned back and saw a coyote running off. My cousin saw it too. We were incredibly freaked out and no one believes us. I haven't been back to that park. It's actually been a bit since I've been back to Phoenix. My cousin doesn't even tell the story anymore. No one believes us. They just think we're making it up for attention. My mom said it was the time. that the light and dark were playing tricks on us. I know what I saw, though. It's weird, and I've read that other people have had similar experiences out in the desert or the woods. It's just one of those weird tales, I guess, that happens to people. I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out what I experienced even as I tell it. The hairs on my neck and arms raise, just at the thought of that afternoon. I hope I'll find someone who has had a similar encounter so I can sleep easier at night. It was the middle of February, usually a bitter cold month where I live in Oregon. But this year it was extra wet. Cold and wet. We get a lot of rain in the northwest, but this kind of torrential downpour was odd for this time of year. I had gone to a friend's house after school. Totally normal. We sat around and played video games and ate snacks his mom made for us. The only thing even remotely odd about the day was the rain. I was a little anxious about the walk home. I knew I'd get soaked, and being cold and soaking wet stinks. The gloomy day was darkening. I knew my mom would start bugging me about getting home for supper and homework soon, so I had no choice but to get up and throw my hood over my head and go. I always walk everywhere with headphones in. I like to listen to music. Helps the time go faster on my way home. The walk takes about 25 minutes depending on how fast I'm walking. I head north toward a small lake that has benches and play stuff for kids. We call it a pond. The word pond is less intimidating maybe, so everyone feels more confident walking around it. I don't know. People feed ducks when the weather is good. No ducks today. They must have gotten the memo that the weather sucked. I didn't see anything. There was nothing out of the ordinary going on at all. In fact, at this point I wasn't even thinking about anything strange. But it wasn't long before I felt something off in the air. I looked around, sort of swinging my whole head back and forth because I was wearing my hood to keep my head dry. I wasn't able to see really great by doing that, but either way, I still saw nothing. And that was the thing that threw me off. I saw nothing. Usually there's at least someone as stupid as me walking in the pouring rain or something. Maybe a couple of ducks would be floating across the water. Something. But everything was eerily still. I looked out across the pond toward the road. There's had to be traffic, a car or two coming home. It was that time of day after all. People were coming home from work. But no, I didn't see a car. No one was walking around the pond or in the street. Even the glassy water on top of the pond had stopped moving. It was like time had frozen. I took my headphones out. The jarring cut from music to the dreadful silence caused a ripple to go up my spine. I almost screamed. The rain pouring down made no sound. My feet splashing on the wet concrete made sound. I quickly jammed my headphones back in to make sure I wasn't going crazy. The music played loudly. I took them off again and shoved them in my pocket. While I was worried that maybe I lost my hearing or something, I wasn't paying attention because the next thing I knew, the sky was completely black. No light, just clouds so dark and thick it made me think of my mom's hair when I was a baby. This thought spooked me just as much as the silence and the dark clouds. I'm not the sentimental type. I started walking much faster. As fast as I could. The way my feet were moving caused the water to splash up to my knees. The raining was pooling on the hood of my jacket. The rain was dumping off my hood into my vision. And still I couldn't hear it at all. I caught my breath and leaned down to pick up a rock, and I threw it in a huge lob into the pond. It seemed to stop time. Finally, it hit the water with a big, echoey plunk. I remember thinking, thank God. I started walking fast again. I wanted to get home as quickly as possible. I could feel the dread in my bones. The silence and the loneliness had gripped me tight. My head was feeling foggy. I took several quick steps and my legs started giving out on me. I fell sideways. Now I was truly drenched. I may as well have gone for a swim. Something in me tightened even more, and I had this sensation like I was the last human on Earth. I have never been so afraid in my life. If I didn't think of my mom and my dad at home waiting for me, I may have stayed down and cried until the rain swallowed me. I pushed myself up onto my knees and then to my feet. I looked around and realized I hadn't made it nearly as far around the pond as I had thought. I could turn and walk back to the entrance to the park I'd came in less than a minute. I looked that way and saw an old black sedan parked right where I had come in. The lights were on. The wipers were going. I couldn't see who was in the car, but I could sense something. There were people in that car. I could feel them watching me. I knew I had no choice. I walked back the way I'd come. My body told me there was no way I could make it if I kept going. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. I kept my eyes down and watched my feet. With each passing step as I got further from the pond, the sound of my footsteps returned little by little. I kicked the water and heard the familiar splashing sounds. When I stepped past the gate marking the park entrance, I saw the black sedan was gone. I am finally ready to share this story. Finding out there were others like me that saw what I did made me feel somewhat sane again. This was in 2012, in Long Island, New York, just a few weeks after Hurricane Sandy hit. Beyond the massive damage, the hurricane had really messed up this year's striper fishing season. After getting out of work around midnight one night, I decided to hit the beach for a few hours and try my luck anyway. It would be too cold soon to go again, and I had already bought a new fishing rod I wanted to try out. When I pulled into my normal spot, the small dirt parking lot was completely empty. Usually there would be a few other fishermen down on the beach, but it looked like I had the beach all to myself that night. Walking down the hill and onto the sand, there was driftwood and trash everywhere. The storm had really messed things up and washed all kinds of stuff onto the beaches. I even heard stories of some crazy deep-sea species found in a few places not too far away, and was thinking maybe I would find one too. Besides being empty, the beach was oddly quiet. Like, really quiet. Usually there were some bait fish jumping up out of the water and handfuls of seagulls squawking along the beach. But tonight, it was just dead silent, the only noise being my sandals crunching on the sand. Even the waves seemed to be muted somehow. Not wanting to walk too far from the trail back to the parking lot, I walked straight out to the edge of the surf and tied up my gear. I was very familiar with this stretch of the beach and knew that at about 100 feet out, the bottom dropped off quickly into the 40 feet deep range. I cast out and then took a seat on the sand, ready to blank out until I caught something or got tired and went home. It didn't take long. After about 15 minutes, my line went taut and started pulling slowly but forcefully to the right. I jumped up with excitement, thinking it may be a shark, since stripers tend to jerk the line around when hooked. In my excitement, I pulled back hard on my fishing rod and immediately felt the line go slack. Shit, I broke the line, I thought. I started to reel back in fast so I could retie my line and cast back out and try to catch this thing. As soon as I reeled in about 10 feet of line, however, it went tight again. I stopped, and then again, the line went limp. I repeated this cycle a few more times until I came to the realization that whatever was out there was headed directly towards me. I stood there dumbfounded, not knowing what kind of fish or sea critter behaved this way, and then I saw it. The moonlight reflected off some kind of black spiny ridge sticking out of the water. The ridge alone, at least the portion I could see, had to be 10 feet long. Then I noticed something else. Where there was water at my feet a moment ago, there was now only wet, soggy sand. The waterline was receding away from me, and fast. I could see clumps of seaweed and shells and a few crabs moving quickly to get out of the way of this thing. Watching the water wash over and then away from this thing was like watching one of those game shows where they pull back the cover on a brand new car. Only the thing under this cover was a complete nightmare. Granted, the moon was shining, but it was still pretty dark, and the complexion on this thing made it hard to tell where it began, and the sand ended. I figured whatever it was had to be at least 30 feet long. I stood transfixed, not knowing what it was or what I should do. Then it started moving. What looked like the upper body of this thing raised high off the sand. In the darkness, the only feature I could really make out was a snake-like head, and right in the center of that, two bright points of yellow light that looked like eyes. The thing started doing a weird swaying motion with its head and body, moving slowly left then right, its eyes sweeping up and down the beach searching for something. My hand was going numb from clutching my fishing rod so tightly that I had to drop it. I don't know if it was the noise or the movement, but the second the rod hit the sand, the creatures had snapped in my direction, and it locked eyes with me. I held its gaze for what seemed like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Then I subconsciously took a step back. Everything happened at once. I saw the water start rushing back in my direction, moving much quicker than it should have on such a calm night. At the same time, the creature lowered its head and began a lightning fast slither right in my direction. I bolted. I wasn't in great shape at the time, but I turned and ran with every ounce of strength and speed that I could muster. I could feel the incoming water nipping at my heels and hear the splashing that the creature's wriggling body was making as it came for me. Finally, I got to the hill and scraped my fingers and knees up in my rapid ascent. Not nearly brave enough to look back, I dashed towards my car, ripped open the door, and slammed the keys into the ignition. I looked up through the windshield and could see the things had just started to crest over the top of the hill. I threw my car into reverse and started driving so fast that a huge cloud of dust kicked up all around and in front of my car. That's probably what saved me. Flipping on the headlight and looking back over the dash quickly, I could just see the outline of the creature in the dust cloud, its head whipping back and forth trying to locate the sound of my car. I drove in reverse the entire quarter-mile back to the main road. Even then, I blew every red light and stop sign on my way back home. I didn't even care that I had left all my tackle and new fishing rod on the beach. I still don't know what I saw that night, and frankly, I don't want to. Shortly afterwards, I sold a bunch of my fishing gear and threw out the rest. The only other thing I'll say is that the few times I found myself near a body of water bigger than a puddle, the very few, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me back from its dark depths. We used to have a farm in North Carolina, and I lived there most of my childhood. It wasn't a regular farm. We actually grew pine trees. Pine needles are popular in the landscaping business, so we grew the trees in order to produce pine straw. We would bale it up every year and sell it to gardening businesses. The house was in the middle of 500 acres of longleaf pines. It was a custom house built in the 1930s and had a huge picture window in the living room. The window was basically the whole length of the room, probably about 50 feet wide. The house was built on a slight hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground and looked out on pine trees as far as you could see. My best friend had come over for the weekend, and we were just messing around in that room. It was winter, so there was a fire going. We were throwing all kinds of stuff into the fireplace to see what it would do. It was getting into the evening and the fire was dying down. We were going to sleep in that room, so we started building a big castle of couch cushions and blankets for our bed. We started hearing the dogs barking outside. They sounded really far away. The property stretches for almost a mile, and the dogs had free rein a lot of the time. I assumed they were chasing off some animal. My friend was staring out the window and not saying anything. I was like, "What's up?" He just kept staring and said he felt like he was seeing things. Of course, that got me curious, so I started staring out the window too. Nothing happened for a few minutes, and I kept asking what he saw. He kept getting annoyed and shushing me so he could focus. Then we both saw a dark, shadowy shape moving from one tree to the next, kind of half running and half leaping from one tree to another. It was probably about 30 yards out from the house. We couldn't actually tell if it was coming closer or not, because the moonlight was reflecting off the slushy snow in the yard and distorting the view, but the figure seemed unnaturally tall. I guess we should have been more freaked out to see someone random on our property out in the middle of nowhere. I didn't hear the dogs at all at this point. We kept staring out there trying to figure out what it was. We should have gone to get my dad, but he was always overreacting to stuff and getting belligerent. He was kind of the type to shoot first and ask questions later, so I didn't want to sound an alarm if it wasn't necessary. But we were definitely a little nervous and didn't want to draw the attention of whatever it was. We didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was owned by a paper company, so it was miles of uncultivated trees. You never really saw people around the farm unless they intended to be there for a good reason. About 5 minutes later we saw it again, but this time it's swooping from tree to tree without touching the ground. And when it went through the air, I swear it had a wingspan, like a 7-foot-tall human-type figure, but with a wingspan. It kept changing trees and was sporadically vanishing and reappearing. Then finally it settled on one tree and sat there facing toward us. I got the binoculars out of the drawer, and when I zoomed in on its face, I knew something wasn't right. It didn't even have facial features, but it was staring toward me with these creepy red eyes. It was crouched in the tree and looked like a giant half-human, half-bat thing. My friend looked through the binoculars and completely lost it. Then while it was looking toward us, it got down from the tree and stepped toward the house. We ran out of the room so fast to get my dad. By the time we got back into the room with him, there was no one to be seen, but both the dogs were barking crazily and scratching at the front door. That was really unusual. If there was ever a creature in the woods, they'd be all over it and chasing it away. We let them in, and they were literally trembling. We ran through the house, locking all the doors and windows. Living in the country like that, we rarely kept the doors locked. Every time I got to another door, I was sure that thing was going to beat me to it and burst in. We got everything locked up and walked around the house over and over, making sure no one had got in without us knowing. My dad was going to go out there with his gun, but I begged him to wait until morning. He slept in the living room with us, not that any of us got much sleep. I never understood why my dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this "we take care of our own" mentality and hated getting the authorities involved in anything. The next day we went out to look, and there were definitely footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between trees, and then we actually saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. But they weren't human. They were these weird, long, 3-pronged prints. We stayed freaked out for a very long time. That's when my dad installed cameras and alarms all around the house. We finally started to relax a little after that. I think the thing that freaked me out the most was how scared the dogs had been. They didn't usually back down from anything, and it almost made me think that it was something supernatural.